In the spring of 1884, a one-room schoolhouse in rural Louisiana reopened after sitting empty for 3 years. The new teacher, Miss Catherine Devereaux, arrived to find 23 wooden desks arranged in perfect rows, each with a slate and primer already waiting. What she didn't know was that the last class never left. They were still taking their lessons, still raising their hands, still waiting to graduate. And they had very specific ideas about who belonged in their classroom. Catherine Devereaux stepped off the mail coach on a Thursday morning, her trunk tied with rope and her teaching certificate folded in her pocket. She was 26 years old, educated at a seminary in Baton Rouge, and desperate enough for work that she'd accepted a position at a school nobody wanted to discuss. The school board chairman, Mr. Arsenault, had been vague in his letters. All he'd mentioned was that the previous teacher had left suddenly. The schoolhouse stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by cypress trees heavy with Spanish moss. Mr. Arsenault met her at the door. He was thin with gray hair and nervous hands that wouldn't stop moving. He explained the basics quickly, his eyes darting to the windows. School would run Monday through Friday, 8 to 3. The children came from farms within 5 miles. She would teach reading, arithmetic, history, and scripture. She would live in the small room attached to the back. Her salary would be $15 a month. He left before she could ask about the previous teacher. That first night, Catherine unpacked by lamplight. The teaching room had a wood stove in the corner and a desk at the front facing those neat rows. Someone had written the alphabet across the blackboard in careful chalk. The primer on each desk was open to the same page, Lesson 14, a passage about obedience and duty. Catherine closed them one by one, noticing how the pages were yellowed and brittle. She heard the first footsteps around midnight. They came from the teaching room, a slow pattern of someone walking between the desk rows. Catherine lit her lamp and opened the door. The room was empty, but when she looked closer, one of the slates had fresh chalk marks. Someone had written, "Welcome." Catherine told herself she'd written it and forgotten. She wiped the slate clean and went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept thinking about those primers, all open to the same page, about the alphabet that looked too fresh for a schoolhouse that had been empty for 3 years. Monday morning arrived with thick fog. Catherine rang the school bell at 8 o'clock sharp. She waited at the door, watching the mist. No children came. At 8:30, she rang again. Still nothing. She went inside and stood at her desk, unsure what to do. That's when she noticed the primers had been opened again, all 23 of them, turned to Lesson 14. She was closing them for the second time when she heard a voice, "You're late." Catherine spun around. A girl stood in the back corner, maybe 10 years old, wearing a dress that had been white once but was now the color of old linen. Her hair hung in 2 braids, tied with faded gray ribbons. She stared at Catherine with dark, serious eyes.
"I'm sorry."
"I didn't see you come in. What's your name?"
"Amélie Landry. We've been waiting for you to start the lesson."
"We?" Amélie gestured to the empty desks. Catherine looked around the room. She saw nothing. No other children. Just 22 empty chairs and one girl in the corner. "I think you're the only one here today," Catherine said gently. "They're all here," Amélie insisted. She pointed to the front row. "That's where Jacques sits, and Marie is next to him, and Pierre is in the 3rd desk, the one with the crack." She moved her finger across the room, naming each invisible student. "We're all here. We've been here since Miss Thibodeau left." Catherine felt cold spread through her chest. "When did Miss Thibodeau leave, Amélie?"
3 years ago. She said she was going home for Christmas. She never came back." Amélie's expression didn't change. "So, we kept studying. We didn't want to fall behind. We're almost ready for graduation."
The girl walked to her desk and sat down. She folded her hands on top of the closed primer and looked up expectantly. "Shall we begin with scripture?" Catherine's first instinct was to run. But she thought about the $15 a month, about the letter to her sister, promising she'd found steady work, about having nowhere else to go. She took a breath, opened her Bible, and began to read. As she read, Catherine kept glancing at the empty desks. She saw nothing unusual, but Amelie sat perfectly still, her lips moving slightly as if following along with words on an invisible page. When the lesson ended, Amelie stood and walked to the door. She paused and looked back. "The others say you're better than Miss Thibodeau. Miss Thibodeau used to get angry when we made mistakes. She would make us stand in the corner facing the wall, sometimes for hours." Amelie's voice remained flat. The day she left, Jacques spilled ink on his primer. She made him stand in the corner all morning. He was still standing there when she put on her coat and walked out. We thought she was coming back. We thought we just had to wait. Then Amelie vanished into the fog. Catherine sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the empty room. She told herself the girl was disturbed, traumatized by whatever had happened to the other students. But that didn't explain the primers, always open to the same page, or the footsteps each night, or the way the slates sometimes had new messages in the morning, written in 23 different hands. The second week, Catherine decided to visit the families. She made a list of names from the school records. 23 students had been enrolled in the fall of 1881. The first 3 farms she visited were abandoned. At the 4th farm, she found an old woman sitting on a porch, shelling peas. "I'm looking for the Landry family," Catherine said. "They had a daughter named Amelie." The old woman's hand stopped moving. She stared at Catherine with rheumy eyes. "Amelie Landry died in the winter of 1882. Fever took her. Took most of the children hereabouts. 23 of them, all told. All students at that schoolhouse." She stood up. "You're teaching there now?" Catherine nodded. "Then you're a fool. That place ain't been right since Miss Thibodeau locked those children inside." The story came out slowly. In December of 1881, a fever outbreak had started spreading through the parish. Miss Thibodeau, afraid of contagion, had decided to keep the school open as a quarantine. She'd convinced parents it was safer for the children to stay at the schoolhouse, away from their families, until the fever passed. The children slept on the floor. Miss Thibodeau kept the doors locked and windows shut. She said she was protecting them, but the fever got inside anyway. It spread from child to child in that closed room. By January, they were all sick. By February, they were all dead. Every single student. 23 children, ages 7 to 14, buried in a mass grave behind the Baptist church. Miss Thibodeau had left the day after the last child died. She'd walked out and never returned. Some said she'd gone back to Mobile. Others said she'd drowned herself in the bayou. "So why's the school open again?" Catherine asked. "Board needed a schoolhouse. Building's still standing. They figured enough time had passed." The old woman looked at Catherine with pity. "But the dead don't forget. And those children, they were in the middle of their lessons when the fever took them. They never got to graduate." Catherine walked back to the schoolhouse in fading light. Her mind kept circling the same questions. If all the students were dead, who was Amelie? Why could Catherine see her when everyone else was invisible? That night she got her answer. She woke to the school bell ringing, not a gentle toll, but frantic, desperate clanging. Catherine grabbed her lamp and ran to the teaching room. All 23 desks were occupied. Children sat in neat rows, hands folded on their primers. They wore the clothes they died in, faded and stained. Their faces were pale, their eyes dark hollows, but they were there, solid, real, looking up at her with terrible patience. Amelie sat in her usual seat. She was the only one who looked almost alive. She spoke for all of them. "We've been waiting for you to give us our final examination. Miss Thibodeau promised we could graduate in the spring, but she left before we could prove what we learned. We've been practicing for 3 years. We know all the lessons. We just need you to test us. We just need you to let us finish." Catherine's hand trembled so badly the lamp flame flickered, but something in their expression stopped her from running. They looked hopeful, eager, like students who'd studied hard and were finally getting their chance. "What happens after you graduate?" Catherine whispered.
We move on. We go where we're supposed to go. We stop waiting.
Catherine looked around at the 23 dead children who'd been trapped here for 3 years, caught between life and death because they'd never finished their lessons. Because Miss Thibodeau had walked away and left them incomplete. She set the lamp down. Her hands were still shaking, but she kept her voice steady. We'll start with scripture tomorrow morning. Then arithmetic, reading, and history. The examination will take all week. If you pass, I'll write graduation certificates for each of you. Will that be enough? The children nodded in unison. Then, one by one, they faded. Only Emily remained for a moment longer. Thank you. We've been good students. We've worked hard. We just want to finish. Then she was gone too. If you've ever wondered what happens when the dead have unfinished business, make sure you're following this channel for more stories about the restless spirits that haunt America's forgotten places. The next morning, Catherine began the examination. She asked questions from the primer. Who wrote the Declaration of Independence? What is the sum of 12 and 17? Spell obedience. The children appeared one by one as she called their names. They answered clearly, voices thin but confident. They'd been practicing for 3 years. They knew every lesson by heart. The examination continued for 5 days. Scripture passages, mathematical problems, historical dates, spelling words. The children never missed an answer. They were perfect students, better than any living class she'd ever taught. On Friday afternoon, Catherine prepared the graduation certificates. She wrote each name in careful script, signed at the bottom, and rolled them with ribbon. At 3 o'clock, she called the children to the front one by one and handed them their diplomas. They took them with solemn faces. No smiles, no celebration. Just quiet acceptance that they'd finally finished what they'd started. When the last child received their certificate, Emily stepped forward. There's one more thing. Before we go, we want you to know what really happened. We want someone to know the truth. The children gathered in a circle. They joined hands. And then they showed Catherine their last day. She saw it like a memory that wasn't hers. The schoolhouse in December, decorated with pine branches. The children at their desks, excited about Christmas. Miss Thibodeau reading a letter that had just arrived, her face going pale. The letter was from the parish health officer. The fever had reached epidemic status. All schools were ordered closed immediately, but Miss Thibodeau didn't close the school. She looked at the children and made a decision. She told them they couldn't go home. She said the fever was in their families, that they'd be safer at the schoolhouse. She locked the doors. She boarded the windows. She kept them inside. The children believed her at first, but as days passed and Christmas came and went, they started to understand. Miss Thibodeau wasn't protecting them. She was protecting herself. She'd come from a wealthy family, and teaching was temporary. She couldn't risk getting sick, couldn't risk fever scars on her perfect skin. So she'd quarantined the children instead, turning the schoolhouse into a prison. When the fever finally appeared, it was too late. The children got sick one by one. They burned with heat. They cried for their mothers. Miss Thibodeau kept the doors locked. She said she was containing the fever, but really, she was just afraid. The children died slowly. They died in their desks, still trying to complete their lessons, still believing that if they were good students, they would eventually get to go home. Miss Thibodeau stayed in her room and listened to them die. She only came out after the last child had stopped breathing. She walked through the schoolhouse one final time, looking at the small bodies slumped over their desks. Then she put on her coat and left. She never reported what happened, never sent for help. She simply walked away and let other people discover the bodies weeks later. The children showed Catherine all of this. The betrayal, the suffering, the way they'd waited for rescue that never came. And then they showed her one more thing. Miss Thibodeau hadn't gone to Mobile, hadn't drowned in the bayou. She'd made it to the main road before guilt caught up with her. She'd hanged herself from a cypress tree. Her body hung there for 2 days before anyone found it. "We wanted you to know," Emily said quietly. "We wanted someone to know we didn't die because of bad luck or God's will. We died because our teacher was afraid, because she valued her own life more than ours." Catherine nodded, unable to speak. The children's memories were still sharp in her mind. "Will you tell people?" Emily asked. "Yes, I'll tell them what happened. I'll make sure you're remembered." Emily smiled then. The first real smile Catherine had seen. It made her look like a living child again. "Thank you. We can go now. We've finished our lessons. We've graduated. We can finally leave." One by one, the children began to fade. Their forms grew transparent, then misty, then disappeared. They didn't look sad. They looked relieved, free, like students walking out on the last day before summer vacation. Amélie was the last to go. She stood in the doorway and looked back one final time. "Don't stay too long. This place isn't good for the living. It remembers too much sadness." Then she stepped through the doorway and vanished. Catherine sat in the empty schoolhouse for a long time. The sun set. The room grew dark. She looked at the 23 empty desks, the closed primers, the blackboard with its fading alphabet. The next morning, Catherine packed her trunk. She left a letter for Mr. Arsenault explaining she was resigning, effective immediately. She didn't mention the children or the truth. She simply said the schoolhouse wasn't suitable for teaching. She walked to the Baptist church and asked to see the pastor. She told him about the children in the mass grave. She insisted they deserved individual markers. The pastor agreed. The markers were placed the following month, 23 small white crosses in 3 neat rows. Catherine never taught again. She moved to New Orleans and found work as a seamstress. But she kept copies of the graduation certificates, 23 names in careful script, proof that those children had finally finished what they started. The schoolhouse stood empty for 2 more years. Then the board had it torn down. They said the wood was rotting. They built a new school 3 miles away, in a different location with no history of tragedy. But sometimes, people walking past the empty lot would hear a bell ringing, children's voices reciting lessons, chalk squeaking on a blackboard, the ghosts of an education that continued long after death should have ended it. The land where the schoolhouse stood is still empty. Nobody wants to build there. They say the ground remembers, that if you walk across it on quiet mornings, you can still feel something watching, still hear faint voices reciting multiplication tables and scripture verses. Amélie Landry's marker is still there, behind the Baptist church. 3rd row, 2nd cross. Amélie Landry, 1872 to 1882, beloved daughter. What it doesn't say is that she spent 3 years after death serving as the voice for 22 other children, that she stayed behind the longest because she was the strongest. Catherine Devereaux died in 1923. She never married, never had children, but in her will, she left a trust fund to maintain the 23 grave markers. The money is still there, managed by a bank in New Orleans, ensuring those children will never be forgotten. The question nobody answered was why Catherine could see the children when nobody else could. Some say it's because she was the first person who truly wanted to help them. Others say Catherine herself died of fever as a child and was revived by a doctor, that she'd been dead for 17 seconds, and that brief crossing had left her able to see things between worlds. But Catherine never explained. All that remains is her journal entry from February 12th, 1884. "Today I taught the dead. Tomorrow I will join the living. I don't yet know which frightened me more." Miss Thibodeau's unmarked grave has never been found. The parish records say it's somewhere on the eastern edge of the cemetery, but the location was deliberately obscured. She exists now only in old letters and court documents. But sometimes, people walking through that cemetery late at night report seeing a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing at the edge of the trees. She never moves, never speaks, just stands there watching the road, as if waiting for someone to arrive, or perhaps waiting for permission to leave. Some say it's Miss Thibodeaux, still trapped by guilt, still unable to move on even though the children she betrayed have long since found peace. The new school 3 miles away is still operating. Teachers sometimes report strange occurrences, books falling from shelves, chalk writing appearing on blank boards, the sound of children's voices in empty classrooms after hours. But the older teachers know better. They know that some lessons can't be contained by walls or time, that education has a way of continuing beyond death, beyond any boundary we try to impose.
They know that somewhere in the parish, 23 students are still learning, still growing, still discovering truths the living can't comprehend.
And on certain February nights, when fog rolls in from the bayou and the air grows cold enough to see your breath, you might hear it. The sound of a school bell ringing in the darkness. Children reciting their lessons. A teacher's voice asking questions that will never be answered by the living. The eternal classroom where graduation day came too late, and death became just another subject to master before moving on to whatever lies beyond the final examination.